When I started teaching and writing about women's human rights in 1991, there was a general sense that the situation of women was improving. There had been a huge and influential feminist movement, although this was beginning to run out of steam. There was a sense of excitement and positivity in the feminist human rights community. Most of all, in the 1990s, feminists in law and political science in universities and on the ground were writing wonderful, inspiring work on how to expand women's rights practice and theory through including the rights of women. By the 2000s, however, the forward march of women's human rights was halted by the rise of religious fundamentalisms, which saw women's rights as a threat. The expansion in understanding of women's rights could not continue under the onslaught of organizing by conservative religious governments, such as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Vatican, as well as fundamentalist Christian churches in the US, which started to work seriously through the UN to impede the progress of women's rights. Women's rights, these religious entities said, were culturally specific or Western or an affront to God. The Commission on the Status of Women had changed, or gradually changed, from a site of opposition from men to a site of opposition from men instead of a triumphal site of progress for women. But at least the feminists were united in trying to preserve and protect women's rights. This changed in the last decade. The threats to women's rights more recently have taken a different form. The threat consists of identity politics, which argue that men who have fantasies about being members of rights-bearing categories other than their own should be entitled to rights based upon their make-believe. The majority of the men who campaigned for what they called the right to expression of gender were those who were called transvestites by the scientists of sex, i.e. men who were sexually excited by imitating women's oppression. They wanted to be able to dress as women in public places instead of secretly in the bedroom or at special clubs and weekends away that serviced their fetishistic sexual interests. From the 1990s onwards, transvestite campaigners sought to get their sexual excitements recognized as a human right. They argued that their interest had nothing to do with sex, although all sexologists before that time said that it certainly was, and their biographies, their pornography, and their websites make it very clear that it is sexual. They invented the idea that they really became women by some magical process by which sex stereotypes associated with women entered their brains and bodies. They gained what they called gender identities. As women, they said they should be entitled to all the hard-won rights of women, as well as special rights, which protected them in the performance of their fetishistic interests in public. There are those who designed and promoted the idea of gender identity rights for heterosexual male transvestites. The fiction they presented that people could change sex was disseminated to other groups who were greatly harmed by it, such as homosexual men who were unhappy loving men whilst remaining in their male bodies, and teenage girls who would once have grown up to be lesbians and now encouraged to believe that medical treatment that seriously and permanently damages health can make them boys. The women's human rights set out in CEDAW and the Declaration on Violence Against Women are based on biological sex and not gender. And by the 2000s, the language of gender as a euphemism for sex was already much in use in human rights work. It was therefore fairly easy for gender identity activists to inveigle themselves into what was referred to as gender and create determined confusion as to what gender actually meant. That would have been harder if the language of biological sex had been retained, because it is pretty obvious that men cannot change their biological sex. The gender identity campaigners piggybacked onto the issue of lesbian and gay rights in order to shove their fetish interests onto the human rights stage.